Welcome to the Korea Pro podcast. I'm your host, Chungmin Kim, the editorial director of Korea Pro.
And I'm John Lee, the editor of Korea Pro.
Join us for a weekly 15-minute conversation as we dive into the most pressing stories shaping South Korea and dissect the most complicated ones for you.
From politics to culture, technology to society, we've got you covered. So stay ahead of the curve and never be sidelined again.
So get ready for a fresh perspective on South Korea's news. This is the Korea Pro podcast.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Korea Pro podcast. It is now Thursday, February 13. It is a little bit before 5:30 p.m. And today in the studio, we have me and Joon Ha.
Hi.
All right, so let's get down to brass taxes. And
Indeed.
Literally.
Yeah, so tariffs.
Yeah. So
What's going on there?
Donald Trump is a man of his word. And so after imposing tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which he later postponed, he then imposed steel and aluminum tariffs, 25% on all tariffs that are coming into the United States regarding these two metals, and as well as copper and some other things. But steel is the pretty big one for South Korea.
Sure.
Now, for those listeners who've been reading South Korean news for a while, this is not the first time that Donald Trump has imposed steel tariffs. He did the same thing back when he was president the first time around. But in 2018, the U.S. gave South Korea an exemption. I forget the exact numbers right now, but I believe it was 2.66 million tons.
Right.
That was the import quota that the U.S. gave to South Korea. He said, okay, you can import this much steel, export this much steel to the U.S., and they'll be tariff-free. But anything beyond that, they will start to incur tariffs.
But there were no sort of requirements this time around, right?
Not this time around. And so all those exceptions and exemptions that were made in 2018, that's null and void now. And we also have to remember that when the Biden administration was in charge, South Korea really wanted the U.S. to get rid of those exemptions too. That exception, that South Korea wanted to export as much steel as possible, but the Biden administration refused. But now, regardless of what or who is saying what about those exceptions, they are now kaput. They're done.
So how is South Korea reacting to this moti? How are they reacting?
Well, the South Korean businesses are, of course, concerned. 25% tariffs is not anything to scoff at. And this will make South Korean steel less competitive compared to U.S. domestically produced steel. But what the South Korean Trade Ministry is saying is that, you know, all in all, is not such a bad thing. They're trying to put a positive spin into this. What they're saying is that because these 25% tariffs are applicable to every country that are exporting steel to the United States, it doesn't impact South Korea that much.
Yeah, but this is not just steel, though. There's going to be other tariffs that Trump will follow on with.
Yeah, he has not followed through on this yet, but he has said this repeatedly, that he is going to impose tariffs on semiconductors and EV batteries. Now, South Korea's exports would be nowhere near where they are today without semiconductors. But if those tariffs go up, then again, South Korean exports will become less competitive. Now, again, we're not quite sure what those tariffs are going to look like. Are they going to be just like the steel tariffs, where it's 25% or whatever the number is for everyone?
Right.
Or will there be exceptions being made? Because we have to remember that I just saw this report. It was an exclusive report from somewhere, so I've not seen this verified by anywhere else just yet. But apparently, TSMC is trying to make a very big deal with Intel right now.
Interesting.
They're going to apparently, again, this is all not yet verified, but I've read reports that TSMC is now trying to get more of its quote-unquote excess chip manufacturing to Intel. It's also going to give technology transfers to Intel. And so if this sort of thing is what TSMC is willing to do, then maybe TSMC might be able to avoid those kinds of tariffs and South Korea cannot.
Sure.
And so if that happens, South Korean exports will be impacted severely. It will be actually quite devastating for the country's economy.
Right. So speaking of Trump, like if we just move on to foreign policy, we haven't really touched, or our government hasn't really touched up on the reaching out to Trump's ministers. Trump himself hasn't really talked to Choi Sang-mok, the acting president, either.
No, there has been no communication via the two leaders. But as we discussed earlier today, there have been confirmed reports now that the South Korean foreign minister, Cho Tae-yul, who is in Munich, will be meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Now, personally, I don't think that they're going to say anything all that surprising when they meet.
Is it just going to be the same rhetoric then?
Ironclad alliance, etc., etc. Now, once Pete Hegseth, or the U.S. Secretary of Defense, and Donald Trump actually chime in, they might say something a bit more out of the blue. But at least when it comes to Marco Rubio, I don't expect anything to be really all that groundbreaking.
And that's quite concerning since, we've seen Japan, Ishiba, and all of his ministers be quite prompt in meeting with members of the Trump administration. Ishiba and Trump, they had their meeting just last week.
Right. This is pretty big. The Japanese foreign minister, Iwaya Takeshi, he met with Marco Rubio as soon as Rubio was sworn in. And just over the weekend, last weekend that is, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba went to the White House to meet with Donald Trump. And from what I've read about those meetings, especially the one between Ishiba and Trump, the meeting was very genteel, adults-like. There was no surprises, which is a win for Tokyo. But because Japan has already got a few steps ahead of South Korea with all of these meetings with their U.S. counterparts, there's a very good chance that the U.S. is going to view Japan as its most important strategic ally in the Indo-Pacific.
Indeed, and that just means that South Korea is just going to play catch-up for now.
Exactly. They're going to make a lot of rules and regulations regarding how Indo-Pacific frameworks are going to be working out. And
the likelihood of snap election, you've got, who knows who's going to be the next president of the
even if we do have elections as soon as possible, the way that we're thinking, maybe in April or May, that's still 2 or 3 months from now. And that's assuming that Yoon's impeachment is held up, there are no postponements. We could be looking at June or even July, but possibly. But by that point, when South Korea has a new government and they're going to have their hands full, right? They're going to have a lot of domestic matters that they're going to have to take care of. They might not have the entire focus or political capital to really shift toward foreign policy, at least not immediately.
I mean, the last time there was an impeachment in South Korea, I think the last acting president, Hwang Kyo-an, he called Trump 10 days after Trump took office.
Right, but Hwang Kyo-an did not have the kind of impeachment overhead that is hanging over his head. When Hwang Kyo-an was acting president, yes, Park Geun-hye was impeached and he was the caretaker president. But it wasn't like now where the first acting president was impeached and now there's the presidential cabinet making their own statements and Choi Sang-mok being the odd man out. At least Hwang Kyo-an did not have that kind of leadership challenge. But Choi Sang-mok is in a different position altogether.
No, definitely, yeah, for sure. And just moving on, so Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, he said quite a few eye-opening remarks yesterday about Ukraine. Can you tell us more about that?
Yesterday, as in European time yesterday, yeah. Pete Hegseth, well, he was part of this Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting, which was established in 2022. And during this meeting, obviously, we knew this was coming, but Pete Hegseth, representing Donald Trump, of course, had a complete 180 turn from the Biden administration. Whereas the Biden administration was very keen on supplying weapons and humanitarian aid and whatever that they could muster to hand over to Ukraine.
Sure.
Pete Hegseth was saying, we're not going to do that anymore. He said that it is unrealistic, quote unquote, for Ukraine to go back to its pre-2014 borders, that the Europeans are going to have to pick up the slack when it comes to defense. And he also said that even if the European nations deploy their troops into Ukraine as a peacekeeping force, it will not be under the NATO banner, which means that even if the Russians strike again, there will be no Article 5. There will be call into action. Exactly. And so what we are looking at is a complete U.S. retreat from Ukraine. Now, this has implications for South Korea, of course. Short term for South Korea, the defense companies are probably going to be salivating over this. The Europeans are going to want to now, very afraid of U.S. abandonment, are going to want to spend a lot of money to beef up their defenses, especially Eastern European countries. Now, of course, France, Germany, Italy, they are going to ramp up their defense production as well.
Yeah, because they've got the systems themselves.
Exactly. But that being said, we have to also keep in mind that European production can have a bit of a bottleneck.
Right.
And so that's where South Korean defense firms come in. They're probably going to be able to say to all these European states, especially Eastern European countries, and saying, hey, we have a record. We've already exported a lot to Poland, and we've been exporting to Romania, Slovakia. We are ready. And so defense firms will be quite happy.
For sure.
But of course, strategic planners, they'll be quite concerned. Now, sure, South Korea is in a very different position. Unlike Ukraine, South Korea and the U.S. have a mutual defense treaty that is several decades old at this point. but there will still be some concern as to how much the U.S. would still be a reliable partner.
Right.
And so that's going to be a lot of things that people will be talking about, at least behind closed doors.
Indeed. And just moving on to sort of domestic politics then.
Yep, you've been paying close attention to this one.
Indeed. So the Constitutional Court hearing that just happened today, Thursday, it looks to mark a conclusion of witness testimonies from both sides, so from the National Assembly's offense team and also the Yoon's defense team. And no additional hearings have been scheduled as of today.
Now, the
from
last
the
time
Constitutional
around,
Court.
when Yoon was cross-examining the former defense minister, and there was a lot of back and forth. Now, didn't the president also request that the prime minister to be at the stand so that he could question him personally?
Indeed, yeah. So that did happen, but it does look like that the Constitutional Court was reluctant to actually accept that. They've been quite reluctant to accept anything from Yoon's defense team.
Did the court
to be
explain
honest.
why?
The court, I do have to check into more detail, but the court did explain to Yoon's defense team that their lack of documentation that they needed to submit before the trial happened was incredibly lax on their standards. And they took issue with that. And just continuing onwards, so if the testimonies are complete today, which they are looking to be, the Constitutional Court will schedule 1 or 2 additional sessions for closing arguments relatively, and President's final statement, likely probably concluding the trial sometime next week. And if the court proceeds rapidly on schedule, then a decision could be made. A lot of experts are estimating late February or early March.
So one way or another, we're going to find out what exactly happens to Yoon by the end of this month. Okay.
But we have a bit of a caveat. So it does follow the typical pattern of 10 to 14 days after the witness testimonies end or the hearings end. However, the ongoing constitutional dispute regarding the appointment of Ma Eun-hyuk, the pending Constitutional Court judge.
The third constitutional justice that the acting president did not appoint.
And it could delay the process. So the acting president, he still wants the parties to come to terms with the appointment of the Constitutional Court judge, even though that they did before the impeachment process was going on.
Now, personally, I don't understand why the Democratic Party is so insistent on having Ma Eun-hyuk be on the bench right now. These 8 justices who are on the bench right now are doing a bang-up job on their own. And also, if we go back in time and look at Park Geun-hye's impeachment, back then they also had only 8 justices. So why is the Democratic Party insisting on the 9th justice being there?
Well, that's still just kind of something that experts and I have still tried to wrap our heads around. The Constitutional Court judge right now, as you've just mentioned, with the 8 justices that are currently seated, they can still call for impeachment or nullify the National Assembly's impeachment vote. However, what the DP is trying to go for is they're trying to look for a full bench, which on the current standards does not look likely, as the acting president is being quite reluctant and his own cabinet is also being quite reluctant to go ahead with Ma Eun-hyuk's appointment. Moving on, all 6 opposition parties proposed a joint special counsel bill on Tuesday to investigate allegations. You might remember in late October last year, we saw some news and some revelations about the president and the first lady being linked to a self-proclaimed political broker. His name was Myung Tae-yul. And Myung has been faced quite a number of allegations from meddling into the elections, the 2022 by-elections to be exact, and also conducting favorable polls for Yoon before the 2022 presidential election. The investigations are still ongoing. It's still a question of whether he will be found guilty or not. But the special counsel the bill that has been proposed to the National Assembly just this Tuesday, if it does pass, it could investigate Yoon and the First Lady's involvement in the 2022.
Just deepening their political troubles even more.
Indeed. And the DP is continuing on with their sort of sweeping arguments and proposals throughout the week. We saw Lee Jae-myung's speech, which he wrote a wonderful executive briefing on that looked towards his sort of a de facto election campaign pledge.
It was a campaign pledge, exactly. It was a campaign speech.
And he covered quite a number, I think it was 6 different categories, where he went on from AI to defense all the way through to economy.
Now, he didn't touch on foreign policy all that much, though.
No, he only talked about increasing the need for dialogue with North Korea. And also, since that they are a part of the liberal democratic bloc and they have received quite a lot as a country, or South Korea as a country has received quite a lot from the Liberal Democratic bloc. He pledged to do his utmost to serve that alliance and be a part of that alliance during his presidency. Of course, he didn't reach a sort of presidential argument at that point. But
now that we're talking about what Lee Jae-myung has been promising and going over the topics, what are the latest poll numbers right now?
Yeah, so the latest poll numbers, I mean, we've seen from MBS, the National Barometer Survey, that it revealed that there's been quite a divide between the political electorate. So the ruling party's approval rating is currently at 37%, according to the MBS, and the opposition's Democratic Party is currently at 36%.
So they are definitely within the margin of error.
They are definitely within the margin of error, and it still will fluctuate all the way to a possible snap presidential election.
But it's still confounding, isn't it? That one of these parties was defending a president who declared martial law.
It is quite the thing that a lot of people are trying to wrap their heads around, seeing as you just mentioned, the PPP's pledges for the past few months have not exactly been a focal point in protecting the Constitution and also protecting liberal democracy. And the PPP's siding with factions that stormed the court in January or last month, that's something that I think a lot of moderates have sort of turned their heads on. The MBS poll also revealed that nearly 70% of centrists are supporting impeaching President Yoon Suk-yeol, compared to before, which was around about early 60 percentile.
Now, of course, none of these polls are supposed to, at least not theoretically, impact the justices' decisions. No. But this is something definitely worth paying attention on so that we can get a pulse on the public.
Looking to stay informed about South Korea's fast-evolving political, business and cultural landscape? Join us on Korea Pro, the go-to resource for in-depth analysis expertly curated by top-tier professionals. And now you can pick the membership level that best suits your needs, thanks to our new subscription packages. Starting at just $199 annually, you can access daily analysis and our weekly podcast. Or try our premium membership package, which offers additional perks such as executive briefings, monthly reports and forecasts, networking receptions and event opportunities, as well as much, much more. To find the best fit for you, just head to signup.koreapro.org and become a member today.
Okay, moving on to the week ahead. Now, as Joon Ha just mentioned earlier, assuming that the trial goes ahead without any sort of hiccups, President Yoon is expected to give his final remarks to defend himself in court. And so we are definitely going to be keeping an eye on that. And of course, by the time that you're listening to this podcast episode, there's a very good chance that the South Korean foreign minister and the U.S. Secretary of State would have already met by this point. And so we're definitely going to keep an eye on that and keep you guys updated. And all of this will be sent to you guys in your email inbox via the Week Ahead newsletter. So if you'd like to know more, please subscribe. Have a good weekend, everyone.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in.
If you want to know more, sign up for our daily executive briefings. We brief you on all you need to know from the past 24 hours and why they matter every morning in your inboxes.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for your weekly dose of insight. And until next time, I'm Jungmin Kim.
And I'm John Lay. Stay connected, stay informed, and we'll see you next time on the Korea Pro Podcast.